Oh, good morning, Protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and only afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for Thursday, and it's November 11th, 2021. It's Veterans Day. It used to be called Armistice Day, the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th hour, when both the Central Powers and the Allied powers put their weapons down and thus marked the beginning of the end of World War I. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody and make certain, again, you have the following materials on your desk. You should have a blue or black pen, multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape, which again, you don't need your correctable tape and highlighters till at the end of watching and viewing the Zoomcast, because I really want you to be focusing, listening, and taking those really good copious notes, not just the main notes, the bullet notes. We got to go beyond that now. We have to be adding information with regards to that oral note taking. So you've already did your notes for today. It's November 11th, 2021. It's Thursday. So what I want to do is I want to finish up those interesting facts on Franklin Roosevelt. And again, as I've stated repeatedly, if you really want to understand a president and the things that they did and why they responded in the manner that they did in terms of different issues or crises, you got to know a little something about them as a person. So let's get back into some interesting facts on Franklin Roosevelt. If you write that down for your topic heading, top line, and we'll use the acronym FDR. Remember, the last president went by an acronym was, of course, his favorite uncle. Let me rephrase that, his cousin, technically, and that would be Theodore Roosevelt, who went by the initials TR. All right, so you don't need to write this down because we talked about this with my last Zoomcast. Going to move my picture out of the way. So this, again, is a photograph, a great photograph, and this, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt's father, James. James, again, was 54 years old when Franklin Roosevelt was born in 1882, if my memory serves me correctly. And that's a photograph of a very young Franklin Roosevelt. We went over this last time, but again, I wanted to point out that this photograph was probably taken, I would say, like 1891, 1892-ish. And again, so at this point, Franklin Roosevelt's father, James, was probably well into his 60s at this time, raising this young boy. But again, the point I wanted to make was the close relationship that James Roosevelt had with his son, Franklin. It was a very loving relationship. And again, when you see the type of family dynamic, when you've got a great relationship between the parents and the children, it usually has a good, happy ending. And then you compare this with, say, the family dynamic with the guy by the name of Adolf Hitler, Adolf Schicklgruber, with his contentious relationship with his father, Alois. And we think that that had a very adverse impact on the person, obviously, that Adolf Hitler became later on. And we'll be learning a lot more about him when we get into World War I. But again, Franklin Roosevelt, or World War II, excuse me. And again, I want to emphasize that Franklin Roosevelt was a child of the progressive era because he would think outside the box like the progressives did. And it was all about, let's bring about change, progress, change for the better. Now, I wanted to share this other photograph with you. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is, again, James Roosevelt. And notice this young child that he's holding on his shoulder. So you would, based on the clothing and the hair, you would assume that this was James Roosevelt's daughter. In actuality, that was his son, Franklin Roosevelt. That's a young Franklin Roosevelt. That photograph was probably taken in the early to mid 1880s. So you have to ask the question, so why is it that Franklin Roosevelt was being dressed in this particular manner? And I just thought it was interesting that Franklin Roosevelt was not only a child of the progressive era, Franklin Roosevelt was also a child of the Victorian era. And the Victorians had a fascinating, what's the word I'm looking for? Not an opinion, but a perspective. That's the word I'm looking for, about raising children. And basically, from the time you were born till about 5 years old, there was no distinction between boys and girls in terms of gender. They were all dressed the same, like young girls. And then it was at the age of 5, that's when the Victorians would cut their children's hair if they were boys, and then start putting on their Buster Brown pants instead of wearing a dress. So it's just an interesting dynamic in terms of the thought process that the Victorians had back in the 1880s and the 1890s in terms of, again, just child raising and childbearing and such. All right. I want to skip over this. You can skip this part. This part I think is really powerful. I want you to write this down. See where my arrow's pointed? I want you to write that down. So we'll skip the part that he had his cousin come and speak at Groton Prep School. So when Franklin Roosevelt was about 5 years old, so this would have been about 1887-ish. He's going to go with his father, and he's going to meet a very famous person in America. And when he meets this famous person at the age of 5, this famous person basically wishes or wants to grant, can't do it, but he wants to grant Franklin Roosevelt, this young 5-year-old, a very unusual wish. So I want you to write this down. So the wish was simple. And this gentleman's looking at this young 5-year-old kid, Franklin Roosevelt, and he says, "My little man, I have a wish for you. I wish that you never become president of the United States." How ironic is that, to say that to the only 4-term president or future 4-term president of the United States of America? Now, the curious thing is who said it. And the answer is, it was that guy. That was Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland said this to young Franklin Roosevelt during Grover Cleveland's first term as president. He was a 2-term president. He was elected in 1884, sworn in 1885, runs for re-election in 1888, loses to Benjamin Harrison, runs for re-election in 1892, wins that one, and is president from 1893 to 1897. So Grover Cleveland has the distinction of being the only president to have 2 non-consecutive terms, meaning he won his first election bid for president, lost the second one, and then won the third one. So you have to ask the question, why would the president of the United States tell a 5-year-old, "I hope you don't ever become president"? So I want you to pause the Zoomcast for a moment. Take about 30 seconds. I want you to draw a line off to the side. And again, I'm going to be circulating around the room and monitoring and making sure that you're doing this and not skipping over this. This is important. You do this. So take about 30 seconds and reflect for me. Why do you suppose that the president of the United States in Grover Cleveland would tell this young future president of the United States, "I hope you don't become president"? I'm going to continue on. So again, from my point of view, what it comes down to is stress. Being president of the United States of America is an incredibly stressful position. If you look, for example, at Grover Cleveland, how his hairline is receding back, hair loss, hair turning gray, those are signs of stress. You look at pictures of, for example, Jimmy Carter, who was elected president in 1976, and then 4 years later in 1980, when he ran for re-election and was thoroughly defeated by Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter aged dramatically. Being president of the United States, is a very stressful position, to say the least. That's why he made that wish. All right, I want you to write this down. So the story is, it's March 17th, 1905. And Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is going to marry a young girl. And by the way, this is St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. And he marries a young girl by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. So yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt, that's her maiden name, and it will remain her married name. So if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, of course, to my laptop screen, that's a very young Eleanor Roosevelt, a very attractive young lady whom she married. Now, they were 5th cousins removed, so they shared the same name, but they were technically from the same family. But there were several degrees of separation in terms of the family connection. Now, another interesting thing, so Franklin Roosevelt does marry his cousin, albeit a distant cousin who happens to share the same last name, two different branches of the Roosevelt family. But what I find more interesting is when Franklin Roosevelt married his 5th cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, on St. Patrick's Day in 1905, she was given away because her father had been dealing with some personal issues. Don't need to go into it. But basically, her father's brother, Eleanor's uncle, ended up giving her away to marry her distant cousin, Franklin. I know you're trying to keep track of all this. And who is her uncle that gave her away at this wedding? Why, it was the president of the United States of America at the time, Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt was the uncle of Eleanor Roosevelt. So his brother was Eleanor Roosevelt's father. And because of his brother, Eleanor's father had been dealing with some personal issues, it was Theodore who ended up giving her away. By the way, I want you to draw a line off to the side. Eleanor Roosevelt goes on to become, I would argue in a good way, the greatest first lady in American history. She was truly a remarkable individual who had a tremendous influence on the Roosevelt presidency and even beyond the Roosevelt presidency. She was a tremendous humanitarian. We'll be talking about her again when we get to World War II. Right? And so one of the cool stories that I read about Eleanor was several years earlier. I think it was 1902, if my memory serves me correctly. And she had been teaching young immigrants in a tenement building in New York City. And she took her then boyfriend, Franklin, who had grown up again with this beautiful mansion, this huge estate overlooking the Hudson River. Franklin Roosevelt never had to work a day in his life. He grew up in a very rich environment. Again, not just culturally, but a lot of money. And Franklin Roosevelt never was really exposed to the other side of American society. So one day, Eleanor took her boyfriend, then boyfriend Franklin, soon to be husband a couple of years later, to this tenement to show him the conditions of some of her students that she was teaching. And Franklin Roosevelt was stunned by this. He couldn't believe that people live like that. And Eleanor looked at her boyfriend and said, yeah, there are a lot of people that live like this. There are very few people that live like we do. And this incident had a huge impact on Franklin Roosevelt's presidency in terms of his desire to, again, use the power of the federal government to try to alleviate the suffering of folks during the Great Depression. I would make a little oral note off to the side on that because, again, it ties in with Franklin Roosevelt being so influenced by the progressive era, thinking outside the box and really actively promoting change. All right. I think this is important to write this down. So Franklin Roosevelt had two political idols. These are the guys that are going to mold and shape his presidency. These are the guys that are going to have a huge impact on the kind of president Franklin Roosevelt's going to be from 1932 or 1933, technically, when he was sworn in, until he passed away unexpectedly in, of course, April of 1945. So number one, yes, write this down. Woodrow Wilson had a tremendous impact on Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. If you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that, of course, is Woodrow Wilson, the last of our progressive presidents. So 2/3 of the progressive presidents, or both of the huge influences on Franklin Roosevelt, were progressives. And that's going to definitely, you'll see that as we get into his presidency when we talk more and more about what we call the New Deal. So Franklin Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson from 1913 all the way until 1920, so for 7 years. So it was during this time that Franklin Roosevelt developed a reputation. He is what we call a hawk. And a hawk would be somebody who believes that when the time comes, it might be necessary to take military action. So as the war drums were beating, 1914, the Great War begins in Europe, 1915, 1916, 1917 especially, it's going to be hawks like Franklin Roosevelt who will strongly advocate that the United States needs to step away from its policy of neutrality and isolationism and really take a more active role and get involved. And we eventually will in April of 1917. All right, let's continue on. So that's one major influence that Wilson has. And by the way, what war is looming during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency? The answer, World War II. So again, the same scenario. War starts in 1939 when the Nazis invade my ancestral homeland of Poland in September of 1939. The Americans, just like in World War I, are staying on the sidelines. And it's only a matter of time before we get involved. And just like how Woodrow Wilson kept saying he was going to keep us out of war, I think Wilson suspected eventually America would become involved in World War I, and we did. And the same thing with Franklin Roosevelt. He's promising people in America 1939 and 1940, we're not getting involved. Oh, I think Franklin Roosevelt knew it was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when the United States became involved. Now, here's the other influence that you're going to see of Woodrow Wilson. So it's not only just in terms of, again, America's involvement in a major war, whether it's World War I for Wilson, World War II for Roosevelt, but also the 14 points of Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, we're going to learn more about this when we get into World War I, was basically his blueprint for world peace. Wilson wanted to reshape the world after World War I had ended, and he wanted to eliminate all future wars. And the biggest part of those 14 points was called the League of Nations. It was going to be this organization of all the nations of the world that would join together and basically work collaboratively, promoting collective security, trying to stop future wars from breaking out. Now, you see this and you see the influence this has on Franklin Roosevelt. At least you're wondering what the influence is. Well, the League of Nations does go into effect after World War I. It's not very effective, primarily because the United States never joins it, which we'll talk about a separate time. But when World War II ends, what's going to happen is Franklin Roosevelt is going to propose that the League of Nations be replaced by a new organization called the United Nations. Sound familiar? League of Nations, United Nations. Again, you see the correlation, you see the influence of Woodrow Wilson. This is the other key point I want you to write down. Wilson felt strongly and adamantly that the United States needed to stop the days of neutrality and isolationism, going back to the days when George Washington warned us to stay out of foreign entanglements, which we did all the way till 1917. But Wilson felt that even after World War I had ended, America needed to stay involved and stay engaged in world affairs. And guess what? When World War II ends, and Franklin Roosevelt technically never lived to see the end of World War II, but he strongly believed that once the war ended, America needed to once again not go back to its days of isolationism and neutrality and get involved. Now, the other key player that's going to have a huge influence on Franklin Roosevelt, it's got to be his big cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, almost 30 years older than him. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, that, of course, is Franklin Roosevelt's cousin, Theodore. And even though they're from two different branches of the Roosevelt family, again, Franklin's from the Democratic side of the family, Theodore's from the Republican side of the family. But you know, it's interesting. If you take off the glasses, the monocles, you can see some familial resemblance between the two cousins. All right, similarities, real simple. And this is important. Number one, they have very similar personalities. They were both charming individuals. They were both energetic, passionate individuals. People love them, and they love people. And it was noticeable. They were both magnets. They just seemed to draw people to them. And I think that's what the American people were looking for in 1933, was somebody that would draw them in and give them hope. Again, Herbert Hoover had a very different personality, much more hands-off. Remember, the octopus arms with the progressives, alligator arms for your three Republican presidents. But right now in 1933, as the Great Depression has really reached its low point or high point, depending on how I'm going to look at it, this is what America needs. Somebody with a Roosevelt type of temperament, a personality. And Franklin very much takes after his much older cousin. Number two, they were both very physically active. We've talked again repeatedly about Theodore Roosevelt, again, being big into boxing. He was into wrestling. He took up jiu-jitsu, a form of martial arts. Franklin Roosevelt also was a very physically active young man, did a lot of swimming, which we're going to talk about shortly. And yes, they both attended Harvard University, one of the great, if not the best, finest university in the United States. Again, the first university founded way back in the 1600s, right outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And one final thing about these two Roosevelts, what they shared in common. So not only do they share similar personalities, they have very similar physical fitness beliefs. They had very similar backgrounds educationally. They both went to Harvard. By the way, Franklin, though, was a very average student. Theodore was off the charts brilliant, great students. Whereas in the case of Franklin, he was a little more of the BC students. However, what they did also share in common was their political experience. Number one, they both get their start in the New York State legislature. This is where Theodore Roosevelt developed his reputation as what they used to call a goo-goo. A Gugu is somebody that wants good government. Number two, they were both assistant secretaries of the Navy. Again, Theodore Roosevelt was assistant secretary of the Navy in the 1890s. He's going to rebuild, help modernize the Navy, and he's going to do it again when he becomes president with the Great White Fleet. Believe the United States needed to get more involved in world affairs by using the Navy. And guess what? So did Franklin Roosevelt between 1913 and 1920. Same thing, using the Navy, giving America a greater presence in the world. I want you to be able to draw these comparisons, these similarities. I think it's important. And they were both former governors of the great state of New York, which seems to be a breeding ground for presidents because Grover Cleveland was also a former governor of the great state of New York. All right, let's continue on. We're going to skip over the differences. This one's important. I want you to write this down. A couple more interesting facts and we'll get into his accomplishments. 1921. Franklin Roosevelt was the running mate with James M. Cox, or for James M. Cox in the election in 1920. Cox was soundly defeated, as we remember, by Warren G. Harding and his running mate Calvin Coolidge. So at this point, Franklin Roosevelt's laying low, and he's thinking about potentially running for the presidency in 1924. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that Franklin Roosevelt loved to swim. So the story is, while swimming near Campobello Island, which is right off the coast of New Brunswick, it's one of the provinces in Canada on the far eastern side by the Atlantic Ocean, Roosevelt comes in the story, and at this point he's married to Eleanor, and he's complaining he doesn't feel right, that he feels chilled and such, and he goes and lays down. And the next morning he wakes up, and then he calls out to Eleanor, and he basically tells her, I can't move my legs. So the doctor comes in, and he gives, at this point, Franklin Roosevelt a prognosis. And the prognosis is that, or actually it should be a diagnosis. The diagnosis is that he has poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis, again, if you look at the root word right there, I would circle this with your pen. Poliomyelitis is polio. It was a horrible disease that people were petrified of back in the 20th century. And if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is Franklin Roosevelt as president with, I believe it was one of his grandchildren. And if you notice, he's in a wheelchair. So Franklin Roosevelt was permanently paralyzed from basically the waist down. So for several years, Franklin Roosevelt had disappeared from the public eye, and he underwent some pretty intense physical therapy. Now, I will tell you, there are very few photographs of Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair, because you have to understand, in those days, people had a different perception of people of physical disabilities. They weren't as always open-minded as we are today. And so Franklin Roosevelt did not like to be photographed in a wheelchair because he wanted to project an image of that he was have good physical fitness and good physical health and so on. And so for basically, it took him 3 years. Watch what I'm about to do. See how I just stood up? It took Franklin Roosevelt almost 3 years to learn how to be able to do that. And he needed the assistance of crutches on his side as well. So let's continue on. So in 1924, I'd like you to write this down. In 1924, there's Franklin Roosevelt right there. He's going to return to the public eye. And it's going to be the Democratic National Convention. They're trying to decide who is going to take on the Republican nominee, and that would be Calvin Coolidge. And so it's going to be at the Democratic National Convention in 1924 that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to launch maybe, just maybe, the greatest political comeback in American history. Now, remember, Franklin Roosevelt had disappeared from the public eye for several years, and people are wondering what happened to him, because there were whispers that he was going to run for the presidency in 1924. Not yet. He's just reintroducing himself to the American people. And by the way, what do you notice as Franklin Roosevelt is giving his speech right here? By the way, you notice NBC right here, David Sarnoff. You notice how I'm weaving together information we covered earlier. NBC, National Broadcasting Corporation. But you notice that Franklin Roosevelt is standing behind the lectern as he's giving a speech. He always stood up when he gave a speech. But what you'd never notice was to the sides and behind the lectern, he would always have his crutches to hold him up. Again, he wanted to project this image that he was in physically good shape and he'd be able to handle the rigors of whatever political position he was choosing to seek. Not president yet, however. We're getting there. By the way, I want to go back for just a moment. I want you to draw a line. Go back up to where I talked about polio. I think there's two influences that Franklin Roosevelt had. One was his wife. There's no doubt about how when Eleanor took him to those tenement building and she was teaching those young immigrant kids on these horrible conditions, and Franklin was stunned that people live like that, that had a real strong, indelible memory on him, a lasting memory on him, an impact. And the same thing with polio. I've been saying this to students over the years. I think polio may have robbed Franklin Roosevelt of his ability to walk on his own without the assistance of crutches or a wheelchair. But I have a whole theory about Franklin Roosevelt. I think polio made Franklin Roosevelt stronger, kids. I do. I really do. I think it made him stronger, not necessarily physically. He was physically stronger. He had to build up his upper chest and his arms to be able to lift himself up and move around. And by the way, he had these very painful metal braces on the sides of his legs that used to dig in and cut into his legs. It was very uncomfortable to wear those. It would have been much easier for him to use the wheelchair. But again, he wanted to project this image to the American people. But getting back to my point about how I think polio made him stronger was because it built up his character. That's what I would emphasize as an oral note, that polio made him stronger, not necessarily physically, but the person he became. And I wonder if Franklin Roosevelt had not contracted polio, would he have become president of the United States? Possibly. But would he have been able to deal with the stress of the Great Depression? And then later on, World War II, you have to have a lot of internal fortitude to deal with two of the biggest crises in not just American history, but world history. And he did it. And I think in that regards, polio made him stronger. And the other thing too, and I would mention this as a side note, what polio also did, he learned how to depend on other people. He depended on other people to help him. And he knew that as president of the United States, when he became president of the United States, that the American people were depending on him and the federal government to help them. Whereas again, you get somebody like a Herbert Hoover, who was orphaned at a young age, and his point was, nobody helped me. I had to be self-sufficient. Franklin Roosevelt learned how to depend on others, and I think that's going to mold and shape the person, the president that he becomes. All right, please write this down. This will be the last interesting fact. This could almost be an accomplishment. So 1933, it's March. Franklin Roosevelt is sworn in as our nation's 32nd president. One of 4 times he's going to be sworn in. The only American president was inaugurated 4 different times: 1932, 1936, 1940, and then 1944. So in 1933, it is a custom and a tradition for the presidents to make an inaugural speech. This is the speech right after they're sworn in. It basically is an opportunity to outline what their goals are, their dreams are, their hopes are for the next 4 years of their presidency. And it's going to be during this speech that Franklin Roosevelt is going to utter one of the most famous lines in American presidential history. So I want you guys to put your pens down for a moment. Can you figure out what that famous line is? Let's see. Here we go.
It is preeminently the time to speak the truth frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
Did you catch the line? You ready? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I have, again, a whole theory about Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt might be the greatest president when it comes to understanding the psyche, the psychology of the American people. He knew at this point the American people were absolutely frightened and petrified. The Great Depression had gone from really, really bad to even worse than that. And he knew one of the first things he needed to do for the American people was to reassure them, we're going to get through this together. I know you're scared, but trust me, you have to have faith in me. as your president, you have to have faith in the government and faith in each other. We're going to get through this together. Don't let the fear overwhelm you. And that simple line really electrified in a positive way the American people. All right, here's what I want you to do. Skip a full page, go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're not going to go into a lot of detail today because we're going to break this down. We're going to cover a lot about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. So make certain again that you date your notes for today. It is November 11th, 2021. It's a terrific Thursday because I'm here and you're here. And of course, I'm recording in beautiful bucolic Roselle. So please write down the accomplishments of FDR. We'll use the acronym. Remember, put periods between the letters. All right, here we go. So as President of the United States of America, Franklin Roosevelt is responsible for 5 major accomplishments. Now, we're not going to do all 5 today. We're actually going to spread this out over several direct instructional Zoomcasts. It's a lot. And trust me when I say this, kids, we're just getting warmed up with Franklin Roosevelt. I'm just introducing him now with the Great Depression. But I'm going to definitely come back a lot to Franklin Roosevelt when we get to World War II. And I'll even circle back and dovetail back to Franklin Roosevelt when we start the Cold War. And that won't be until March of 2022. All right, here we go. Number 1. So one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt is most remembered for, one of the things that really is going to help guide the nation as we are trying to navigate these rough waters of the Great Depression. I'm using metaphors. Mr. Podolsky and Mr. Fisk would be very proud of me. The creation of what we call the Braintrust. So here's the story. If you direct your attention to the overhead screen, no, that's not the Braintrust, that's the human brain. So the point I'm making is this. Franklin Roosevelt, I would draw a line off to the side. This is a great example of oral notes. So Franklin Roosevelt, remember, was not a great student. He wasn't his cousin. Theodore was off the charts brilliant. Theodore graduated at the top of his class. Franklin, not so much. But what Franklin realized, and this is the sign of a great president and a great leader in general, you recognize your limitations. You realize your limitations. And what you do is you try then to fill in the gap with and help try to consult and get people to help you in the areas you're not that good at. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was not good at economics. That was not his forte. His forte was psychology. His strength was being able to understand, what the American people were feeling and thinking. So he understood that, you know what, you got all these people saying we should try this. Do we go the liberal approach? Do we go the conservative ideology? Do we go the radical ideology of dealing with the Great Depression? So what Roosevelt's going to do is this is a great example of thinking outside the box as a child, or not a child, but as somebody influenced by the progressive era. So I want you to write this down. So instead of surrounding himself with politicians, okay, who would guide him and say, well, Mr. President, we think you should follow the conservative ideology or the liberal ideology or the radical ideology of dealing with the Great Depression. He instead goes to college professors. There's an old saying that if you really want a ripe apple, you don't go to the barrel, you go pick it from the tree. And his concern was if you surround yourself with politicians, they're just going to be telling Roosevelt what he wants to hear to help their own further their own career. But instead, he says, I'm going to surround myself with college professors. These are truly experts in the field, and they're not interested for political gain. And that's what Roosevelt wanted. He wanted people that would give him good advice that would help the American people and help the nation try to navigate the waters of the Great Depression, not a bunch of politicians that are going to then take credit or deflect the blame because they're trying to advance their own political career. Outstanding. That's great thinking. Please write this down. So these college professors, these advisors, these were econ professors. Econ is the cool way in college. We would say when you take an economics class, you call it econ. So they were the ones who were going to help him, he being Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, deal with the Great Depression. They're going to offer him some advice. So I'm going to skip over one point with regards to this. We'll come back to here in just a second. All right. So I want you to draw a line off to the side. I'm not going to go into the key players of the Braintrust. I think it's more important to understand the influence they had. So I want you to draw 2 lines off to the side. We're going to add some oral notes to this. So number one thing what the Braintrust did is they're going to be the ones who help formulate what's called the New Deal. I want you to write that down. The New Deal is going to be Franklin Roosevelt's plan for dealing with the Great Depression. And the Braintrust was very instrumental in helping him create this New Deal. And number two, the other thing I want you to mention as a side oral note is his brilliant inaugural speech, 1933. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Again, a member of the Braintrust helped him create that speech and that very, very important seminal line. Let's continue on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so here we go. I want you to write this down. So this will be the only other accomplishment I'm going to at least start today. And I want to talk about the 100 days. So when you look at the 100 days, you're looking at a little over 3 months, basically. And so what you look at is what Franklin Roosevelt accomplished in 100 days, what some presidents don't accomplish in 4 years. Roosevelt's attitude is, we're going to get going right away, and we're going to take some actions. And if they work, great. And if we don't, roll up our sleeves and let's figure out a better play. So I want you to write this down. So for the first 3 months of his presidency, Franklin Roosevelt, again, working closely with his Braintrust. Again, Adolph Burley and Raymond Moley, those are two of the big players in the Braintrust. I didn't mention them. I'm just mentioning them in passing. I think it's more important to understand them collectively, the tremendous impact and influence that they had on Franklin Roosevelt. So one of the things that Roosevelt liked was mottos and slogans. He thought it was something catchy, something that would grab the attention of the American people. Again, I think Roosevelt was a master psychologist. He really understood the mindset of what people really needed at this point. And what people wanted to hear was some reassurance that we're going to get out of this terrible calamity. And so one of the mottos that Franklin Roosevelt had in the first 100 days was what we call action, action now. And this was something that Roosevelt felt very strongly about when he worked with his Braintrust, his group of economic advisors. These were college professors. And his attitude was, I want you to brainstorm. I want you to collaborate, bounce ideas off each other, come back with a solution. Let's try it. And if it doesn't, if it works, great. And if it doesn't, okay, take some notes. Don't despair. Don't worry. You're not going to lose your job. But let's then roll up our sleeves and figure out what went wrong and what do we need to do to make it better. Again, it's not the conservative ideology of Herbert Hoover where you stare at the tree that's got the dead branches and you ignore it. No, Roosevelt's point is get those shears out and let's cut off the dead branches. So what's the very first action Roosevelt takes? So Roosevelt's very first action is he's going to declare what's called a bank holiday. Now, what does that mean? Please write this down. So what Roosevelt's going to do is for the next 4 days, from March 4th through March 8th in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt is going to shut down all banks. Now, you have to ask the question, why would he be doing this? Why would the Braintrust feel that this was a good thing? Now, remember, the banking system had more or less collapsed and it was paralyzed. People were not putting their money in the banks anymore. And if they had money in the banks, they were very quickly taking it out. They were petrified the bank would close its door after a bank run, and they were hiding their money in their mattress or digging a hole in their backyard. And Roosevelt realized we have to stop people withdrawing their money, or otherwise we're never going to get out of this situation. So all the banks closed down for 4 days. This, of course, is one of the big banks today, and that's the Bank of America. So what's the purpose? Number one, as I stated earlier, the Braintrust told Roosevelt, we've got to shut the banks down for at least 4 days. We've got to get the American people to stop running to the banks, and we've got to get them to leave their money in the banks. Otherwise, if everybody just keeps pulling their money out, the whole banking system is going to collapse, and the whole country is going to collapse as a result. And number two, what he wants to do, and again, this is why I keep going back again and again to Roosevelt being a master of psychology. He understood that in order for us to get out of this mess in dealing with the failure of the banking system, you've got to restore confidence in the American people. Stop burying your money in your backyard. I'm not exaggerating. That's what people used to do, or hiding it in their bedroom mattress. But rather, leave your money in the bank, put your money in the bank. And if we do that, we're going to start setting the wheels into motion for eventually the United States getting out of this terrible economic calamity. Action number two. So the second action was on March 8th, 1933. So Franklin Roosevelt at this point is going to call for a special session of Congress. We're in an emergency, kids. So both houses, the Senate, the upper house, the House of Representatives, the lower house. And so what's going to happen is this is a minor miracle. In less than 8 hours, I mean, I'm looking right now at how the federal government under President Biden is trying to pass 2 big bills and how this whole process has been so laborious and time consuming. And are they going to get it going? Are they going to pass it? Is President Biden going to sign it? Is he going to veto it? Roosevelt did this in less than 8 hours. So in less than 8 hours, again, this is the beauty, I think, of Roosevelt and the time that where people put aside their political differences, Democrats and Republicans, and they work collaboratively. What a concept. They work collaboratively, and in less than 8 hours, Congress passed the bill. It was signed into law by then President Franklin Roosevelt, and it's called the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. Astounding to me. They did this in less than 8 hours. I would challenge right now, and I'm not taking sides between, again, our 2 political parties and so on. All I'm just saying is learn from the past. How is it that past Congresses were able to put aside their differences for the betterment of the country? And that's what we need to get back to. Listening, compromising, working collaboratively. This is the beauty, again, of why it's so important to learn history, to learn from the past, to gain the knowledge. So what's going to happen is a couple of things. Number one, so we're going to start reopening the banks now. But now here's the key. The bank has to demonstrate that it has the sufficient funds, the money to reopen. Because the fear is if you let banks open up that don't have enough money, you're going to be back at square one. And then the rumors are going to spread that the bank's running out of money. You're going to have a bank run, the bank closes the door. So you've got to, the banks are now going to have to demonstrate to the federal government, progressive era, the government's going to get more involved now. You got to demonstrate you got enough money. You don't have enough money? Sorry, you can't open your doors. And then also, what's going to happen is under the Emergency Banking Relief Act, this is part of what we're going to call the New Deal. It's going to create what's called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, still around today in 2021. So basically what the FDIC did was this is the first of the major agencies that Roosevelt and the Braintrust are going to create what's called under the New Deal. So they're basically saying to people, if you got $5,000 of money in a bank, and let's say worst case scenario, something happens to the bank, the government guarantees that money's going to be there. So the government's kind of acting, you can add this as a side oral note, like an insurance company. They're insuring, they're guaranteeing, don't take your money out, leave it in the bank. If something again happens to the bank, you can go to us, we'll get you your money. And so the point of this is real simple, to draw a line off to the side. It's trying to convince the people, the American people, that A, leave your money in the bank, and B, maybe even more importantly, stop depositing your money in your mattress or stuffing it in your mattress and start depositing your money back in the banks again. And this action is going to electrify the nation. Suddenly, people are going to start to slow up on taking their money out, withdrawing their money, and very slowly and surely, people are going to start once again to put their money back in the banks. And that's the power of Franklin Roosevelt. So I'm going to finish up with one other action, then we're going to wrap it up. So action number 3. So Roosevelt realized the 18th Amendment didn't work. You remember the 18th Amendment? That was prohibition. Remember, you can't sell, distribute, manufacture, consume alcohol. And then shortly after the 18th Amendment was ratified first by, again, Congress, you need 2/3 votes of Congress, 3/4 of the states. And then they passed the Volstead Act, which enforced prohibition. What did it do? All it led to was organized crime breaking out, Al Capone, bootleggers, speakeasies. It was not enforceable. So Roosevelt said, if you can't enforce it, let's drop it. So the first thing he's going to do is he's going to repeal the Volstead Act. We're not going to, so the Volstead Act meant you're going to enforce prohibition. We're not going to enforce it anymore. And ladies and gentlemen, remember, this is a photograph of G-men dumping out alcohol into a sewer drain. And so what's going to also happen is at that point in 1933, in the first 100 days, you're going to see the ratification of the 21st Amendment. And what the 21st Amendment did, draw a line off to the side, was it repealed the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment promoted prohibition of alcohol. The 21st Amendment is the only amendment that repealed an earlier amendment, and it basically said, no, we're not going to prohibit alcohol consumption, distribution, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what did people do as a result of the 21st Amendments? For the first time since 1920, they began to legally drink wine once again. So there you have it, sports fans. That's today's Zoomcast. I hope you enjoyed this one. I tried to keep it under an hour, just smiling. So again, at this point, make sure that you take out your correctable tape. Make sure you clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. This is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. Remember, you're going to keep this with you, not just through this year, but also into high school. You're going to be using this freshman year in world history, absolutely, but especially your junior year. You're going to come back someday and you're going to say, thank you, Mr. Bonk. You will. And then you're going to take out a couple of highlighters, 2 different colors, 3 would even be better. Go through. You have to do this right now. Don't wait. By highlighting it, again, tip of the tip, focus on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. You're reinforcing that information. It's a natural, organic way to study. That's why I have you do it. Don't color. Focus on those words, create those pictures in your mind. It truly allows you to develop a greater sense of mastery and understanding. Remember what I keep saying again and again, master, don't memorize, and tell the story. When you're done with your highlighting, go back 10 to 15 minutes. You're going to review your ISN. You don't close it up. Go back and review over the information. At home, if you have the opportunity, please, this is the best way to study. Hand your notebook to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, an older brother or sister, maybe an aunt or an uncle that are visiting that had me 30 years ago. And you channel your inner Mr. Bonk. Talk about and teach whomever you're working with. Talk about, again, Roosevelt going with his girlfriend, Eleanor, to a tenement and what a profound impact that had on his mind. Or even, what, for example, when he contracted poliomyelitis, polio, and how he learned how to depend on other people. And this really had an impact on his presidency, how he disappeared for 3 years, just learning how to stand up on crutches. How he tried to reassure the American people with that famous inaugural speech, hey, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We're going to get through this together. He was a master psychologist. Talk about his 2 political influences. Again, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt. Huge influences, 2 progressive presidents. Federal government getting more actively involved in the lives of the American people and corporations and business. Talk about the Braintrust. Why did he surround himself with economic advisors and college professors? Why not just surround yourself with politicians? There's a reason for it. The brilliant Roosevelt. Talk about the first 100 days. Why did he close the banks down for 4 days? What happened when he reopened the banks 4 days later with the Emergency Banking Relief Act? How did he guarantee that your money would be there? Remember the FDIC? Talk about that. And why did he have the 21st Amendment adopted and ratified to repeal the 18th Amendment? So again, I hope you enjoyed this Zoomcast as much as I love making it. As I always like to say as I wrap up a Zoomcast, you know, the story may have ended today, but the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, be well.